That was Johnny Blues and the Bucket Kickers. And this is Maximus Confesses. What you are about to listen to is a discussion that took place between me and my friend Jimmy Stevens. It took place August 21st, 2015. Jimmy was having a discussion with me and moderating it. He was coming from the presuppositionalist apologetics perspective, while I was coming from the cumulative case perspective. What you'll hear is our exchange. Please enjoy.
My name is Jimmy Stevens, and I'm just kind of a philosophy and apologetics junkie. And this is my buddy here, Max. Max, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, my name is Maximus Confesses. I'm also an apologetics junkie, theology junkie, and sometimes I like to explore a little bit of philosophy here and there. I have a channel, Maximus Confesses, which is out. Currently, I have only 2 videos up: the introduction and the typical trailer video. But hopefully, there will be more up on topics such as theology, metaphysics, epistemology, and of course defenses from very common arguments made by atheists against the Christian faith.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that in this video, kind of the goal that is held between me and Max is we'd like to show the different types of apologetic methods, and specifically, I am of the presuppositional camp. I'm coming from a Calvinistic and a Reformed background, and Max holds to a much more Augustinian theology than I do, and his approach to apologetics, I think you would consider classical, right?
No, actually, I would consider a cumulative case method.
Oh, you're going for the cumulative case. Okay.
Right.
Correction on my part. So, Max, you're going for the cumulative case methodology of apologetics. And so this video is, we're going to ask each other questions, and the goal is to show where we have similarities and where we hold to the essentials of the faith, but at the same time, sort of distinguish our different methods and show the distinctions that can be made and where we may or not disagree about methodology. And there's going to be maybe some background talk about our Christian worldviews in general, about epistemology, metaphysics, and axiology. So I'll just jump in here and ask you, Max, what do you think is the main intention, consciously speaking? What is the apologist supposed to be thinking about when he comes into a conversation with unbelievers? What is the goal of the apologist in his thinking?
All right. So the apologist, being a Christian, has to come into it thinking that there's a hope in his heart for something, which is kind of categorized in Peter 3:15. There's kind of a hope in our hearts given to us by the Holy Spirit. And it's something that is by nature intellectual. It's not something that is contrary to reason. It's something that reason abides by, and reason does not contradict. And when the believer comes into that conversation with such things, what they want to do is show that what they believe is indeed not only not contradictory to the dictates of reason, but reason itself prescribes that we believe in such things. That I would say has to be the proper mentality.
Excellent. Okay, I would also agree. I think that I assume I'll be quoting Bonson a bit too much in this video, but I remember him in his talk with an atheist over the radio.
George Smith.
Yeah. Or Smith. So I think that he made a note about how Christians oftentimes sort of throw away apologetics, or excuse me, throw away reason, and they sort of try to replace reason with an epistemology that puts faith in the place of reason, and this is something that uh, Christians do, and they don't realize that it's actually very defeating of the faith. Really, it's against what we're trying to do here in apologetics.
I completely agree with that. The notion where faith replaces reason and it's seen in a very different camp as reason is something known as fideism. It's something that has been accepted by a good camp of Christian thinkers, such as Soren Kierkegaard is the most famous example, but you could also see it in other earlier Christian thinkers such as William of Ockham. Now, what I believe the apologist has to do is not say that faith is in a different camp than reason, but rather faith is something that supervenes on reason. It's something that is revealed to us, and it's something that reason that is compatible with it. But again, a bridge can be drawn between the two to show its compatibility. And when Christianity consistently shows a vitality to come up with answers to skeptical scenarios, thoughts, ideas, when it has that veracity, this is just this is just greater and greater reason to believe in the faith. And I think by building this bridge between the two, by showing the veracity of the Christian faith, one is able to show its likeliness towards truth to the non-believer. Now, when the Christian takes this approach, they are eschewing fideism and showing that there are things that are demanded by the doctrine that reason itself does show, and for whatever reason does not show. The prime example, let's say the Trinity and God's existence. I believe natural reasoning does show us God's existence, but the Trinity is something that's revealed to us by revelation. Yet the doctrine of the Trinity itself is not only rational to hold, but it's also something that clears up a lot of uh, prima facie problems. Prima facie means on the face value problems with just a Unitarian God. For example, the Christian God is characterized as all loving, yet a Unitarian God would have a huge difficulty showing this as a virtue. And because, well, a God who is all loving would require someone to love. Self love is kind of selfish in its own nature. But if it's between three persons, then it's something that is in itself perfect. And it's something that is shown to us by faith. It's not something any thinker reasoned themselves to. I mean, why just three members of the Trinity and not two, or four, or five? But the multiple personhood of the Trinity is something that is revealed to us by by revelation. But it's something that can answer questions with regards to skepticism to God, and yet at the same time, it's something that does not contradict rational thought.
Right, and the lack of contradiction there is just the first part that you mentioned before that you would like to establish, right? Your goal here, Max, is not just to show that Christianity is consistent, but also that there is a case to be made for it. I think you used the word that it's prescribed by reason.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And this is kind of where the cumulative case method comes in, and I'll just juxtapose it with the classical method. So the classical method searches to first establish the existence of God, and then seeks with historical evidence to put on top of that the truth of Christianity through the historicity of the resurrection itself. Whereas I, as a cumulative case apologist, would not go down that route. I don't think, well, I do think that there are logical arguments for the existence of God. I think we actually have to approach this from a case of Christian categories and a worldview conducive to it. So let's take, for example, Thomas Aquinas's 5 ways. A lot of them are actually based off of Aristotelian and Platonic categories. Yet, how are we supposed? Yet, considering that most modern thinkers are kind of ruined by modern philosophy, kind of ruined by philosophy after the time of Descartes, they're more likely to be skeptical of these categories themselves. So these categories are something I would have to say, once accepted, do by way of reason lead to the existence of God, but you want to build an cumulative case for the Christian metaphysical worldview, and I'm going to call this the patristic and scholastic metaphysic of the church. I think those are necessary to avoid certain skeptical problems without weakening one's epistemology and ontology, and thus because they work better with reason and rational inquiry than all these other categories in worldview, then they're more preferable. And you could actually build a greater possibility using, I believe, Bayesian probability inference. So you could actually compare on the metaphysical view of the patristic and scholastic thinkers of the church and juxtapose them with a more secular worldviews, like take pragmatism or take pretty much anything any other kind of worldview you want to make. How does you could bring up how do we account for our moral senses? How do we account for our rational faculties being capable of deriving truths? Things of this nature. So that's the method I take.
If I could ask a follow-up question, I would be curious as to how someone who's taking this patristic metaphysic, how they take up this model. Why do they take up this model? Is it at the as a result of further arguments? Is it something inferred from some other type of argument, or is this something that you would take at base value, that you would say is something more basic to maybe epistemology?
So what I would do is I would sort out these categories as being prima facie true and coherent amongst themselves. And once they are coherent amongst themselves, you could basically build up any worldview you like, and you could always argue for its coherency, how it might interact. But once the coherency of the particular worldview is built up, then you have to take in other accounts, evidences you see in the real world itself, its consistent ability to account for human interaction with knowledge, humanity's moral senses. Once these are built up, you kind of build a constant verification through these. So, for example, let's take the truth of Christianity as opposed to naturalism. Not a pure naturalism would have a harder time, I would think, maintaining an objective sense of morality, whereas a Christian worldview would not. Now, there are naturalistic worldviews that take a more subjectivist or anti-realist approach when it comes to ethics, and that's fine. But once you bring up this kind of ethical value, you might bring up skepticism about our senses to discover other objective moral things. I mean, if our moral senses are wrong, then how can we trust these other senses? And if we can, in some sense, trust these other senses, then it kind of leads to a decrease of probability for them. So that would be my answer. I hope I did a good job there.
No, that's exactly the sort of thing that I'm asking. So it sounds like then, Max, that your methodology is to sort of take these things for granted and sort of see how they see that they are coherent just in themselves, and then from that framework kind of construct arguments that you could say coalesce into one great evidence for the hope that we have.
Exactly. And of course, no, it might. So this is I think you got that correct. And it also makes things like take for example the resurrection far more probable than not. Now the resurrection is nil, zero on naturalism, because there is no God to bring Jesus back from the grave. And if there was a man named Jesus who came back from the grave, there you could probably come up with some kind of naturalistic account for it. Um, I'm not sure how, but maybe like the Epicureans, you could believe that atoms swerved to create something random. Um, although I doubt many atheists would take that view nowadays. But when it comes to the Christian worldview, when these basic categories are put in place, a chance for a resurrection does increase. So that's how they work with one another. And you could take something along the lines of Hume's argument against miracles. While it is true that an argument against miracles would let's grant it, for example, that we're never justified in believing miracles because there's always a greater probability of a lie or a deception or something along these lines. We'd actually have to make an exception for the miracles on the grounds of Christian theology, because the miracles on the worldview of Christian theology would be far more conducive than, let's say, the Islamic worldview or the Hindu worldview. But on the other hand, if let's say a Hindu or a Muslim can just approach this system in the same way and prove their categories would be better, then we would also have to concede, if that were the case, that yeah, the Islamic worldview or the Hindu worldview could their miracles would be the ones we'd follow. That way, it wouldn't be just simply special pleading on that regard. You'd have to come up with some theological model, and um, so yeah, this way you don't have to go to the particulars and make justifications for each one, but rather you could accept the whole of the faith and accept the essential miracles as being needed because you're accepting the whole of the worldview. So this way you don't just mortar the bricks to the house, but rather you get the house and then from there on in you accept the bricks as just being there as a necessity for the house existing.
Right, you kind of take a holistic view to the various different evidences. They don't come one at a time, but and hence it's called the cumulative case.
Exactly. I believe that the problem with classical apologetics, which is why I wouldn't classify myself as one anymore, is that when Aquinas was using his proofs, theologians at the time held to the same general categories. There was no difference there. But because I find I'm living in a modern age with people who have very different viewpoints on epistemology, morality, metaphysics, that because there's just so much diversity there, that what has to happen is the whole of the patristic and scholastic metaphysical worldview, as opposed to um, just finding one solid deductive argument and then a good probabilistic argument for the resurrection.
Right, which that's basically the distinction there between classical apologetics and the cumulative case.
Right.
Okay, well, I have taken 20 minutes of our 30 minutes asking you questions. I feel a little bad. I apologize. I didn't mean to.
No worries. Can I just spend the next 10 minutes asking you questions?
Sure, go ahead.
All right. So presuppositionalism, as I understand it, is the notion that the truth of Christianity is preconditional for rational thought and coherence. So if Christianity is false, then knowing anything is impossible. But because knowing things is possible, we can't possibly deny that. Then, of course, it follows that Christianity is true, just to use some basic modus tollens. Would that be a fair description of your approach?
Yes, I think so.
Is there any caveat you'd like to add?
Sure, I would say that while deductive categories can be used, and in fact are used in the arguments made, I would say that the presuppositionalist wants to take on a transcendental method where really all he's doing is granting the skeptic some kind of general belief that he has, but then questioning the grounds on which that belief lies, right? And the presuppositionalist is saying, look, you can't have that belief unless that belief finds itself in the more fundamental worldview of Christian theism.
Right. Okay, that's fair enough. Now, I want to ask you, because presuppositional apologetics heavily evolved in the Reformed camp, although there are Calvinistic and Reformed thinkers such as R.C. Sproul who are more classical apologists, because it evolved in this particular realm of theology, do you think it would be possible for, let's say, a Catholic or an Arminian to take up the same apologetical approach? If not, why not? If so, how come you would disagree? How would you explain why they haven't taken this approach themselves?
That's a really good question. So actually, I would say that I think it would be rather self-defeating, actually, to try to take this approach with already having a Calvinistic position on soteriology. And the reason I would say the presuppositional apologist's view of epistemology heavily relies on the view of God that Calvin had, which is that God knows all the facts in history. He knows everything about the universe. And the reason he knows everything about the universe is he has a plan for it. And in fact, he's responsible for predestining all the facts in the universe. And so for the presuppositionalist, sort of the edge of his sword is built on the hilt, that we're appealing to the revelation of this God who knows all the facts in the universe, and he knows them precisely because he's responsible for them. But for someone who doesn't hold to that same framework of theology, I'm not sure how they're going to have the same kind of edge to the sword, as it were, when they're appealing to God's knowledge, right? It's a little bit different for someone who believes in freedom of the will and how God can be prescient of the future without being responsible for predestining it.
I see. So if God truly is predestining, those who will be saved by His command, it is a fact that they will be saved. If that is the case, why even bother approaching the non-believer from the perspective of the presuppositionalist? Because if the non-believer is indeed going to just be if the non-believer is in fact just going to reject God and continue on in their denial of Him, then what point is there in giving him any apologetic? And if the only way I could kind of see it is for the case of evangelizing other people. Now, if it is the case that presuppositionalism will help to evangelize those who have been elected, what do you think it is about presuppositionalism that would appeal to those who are indeed elected?
Sure, that's a great question. So it seems like maybe there's two tines of a fork to bite down on there. There's the first, what is sort of the common ground between the unbeliever and the believer that we can have any kind of relationship? Because obviously, if we're trying to evangelize people who are not yet Christians, it would be rather useless to give them an apologetic where there is no common ground, where there is no place where we agree on some things. And I think that for the presuppositional apologist, his understanding is that because God, as the Logos, has revealed himself to everyone, has revealed himself to reality, has come down to us and made himself known, such that none of us have any excuse on Judgment Day to say, well, I didn't know you. For that reason, we have common ground in that all of us is actually in our heart of hearts aware of this God. We're aware of this divine reality. And so the presuppositionalist is, through these rational arguments that he makes, kind of trying to convict the person of that knowledge, trying to reach out to that knowledge, to appeal to it, to say, hey, look, we are both human beings. We're both made in the image of God. and part of that means that we are beings who are made under the revelation of this God.
Mm-hmm.
But then to answer sort of the second question, which is what are believers going to find appealing about this? I think two things especially, although there could be other answers given. Number one is that this apologetic, I think, really stood out to me as the apologetic which doesn't really compromise. And while that is that can be rather
I'm not
something
taking
to
it.
be.
Hey, I'm not going to take it personally. Don't worry about offending me.
It's something you could take personally, right? So it's argumentative, right? That's something that's argued over. But for the presuppositionalist, he sees this argument as something that is undubitable. It's something that's unquestionably so.
Mm-hmm.
And so, sort of the strength that the presuppositionalist throws out there, which is up for question. I would be happy to discuss that. Is that it's not merely a probabilistic case made, but this is an absolute case made. This is it's an infallible self-attesting case that is supposed to be made. The other reason being simply that I think that presuppositional apologetics, when understood rightly, is actually quite simple, because all you really have to do is, again, you're admitting something that your opponent has, which for the presuppositional apologist is interpreted to be found in the imago Dei. It's to be found as part of his humanness.
Mm-hmm.
And he simply admits this, but then tries to reorient it and say, well, that is true, but that belief is incoherent within your own ideology, within your own system of metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. Let's try it. Why not try to put it in my worldview? Because I think that I have an opening. I think that I have a consistent place for this belief to find itself.
Huh. All right. I think there is a little bit of common ground between us, because we both agree that the approach has to be holistic as opposed to particularistic. That is, where we should defend the Christian viewpoint as a whole, as opposed to just proving it by its parts and pieces. So I'm actually glad we have that common ground there. But when you say something is indeed absolute, isn't the knowledge gained by saying Christianity is absolute through the impossibility of the contrary, by showing consistently that other contraries just suck? For example, if you were approached by a Muslim, or you were approached by an atheist or a Jew, or pretty much pick whatever worldview you want. Your claim is that you could always smash the ball right back in their face every time they go for a layup. Just to use some basketball analogy there. But you're not really proving absolutely that your worldview itself is absolute. You're just proving that compared to these other ones, that yours continues to flourish. So if you so isn't it like through a form of consistent induction in terms of the failures of other worldviews that yours remains absolute? And if so, how could it be absolute in itself?
That's an excellent question. So this question comes up every once in a while. I'm surprised. It comes. I've seen it asked by various skeptics in academia, but I very rarely come across this question. In talking with people in Google Hangouts, which I find odd. But anyways, it's a great question because
I've read the literature.
yeah, right, yeah, it comes up in that quite a bit. I think that it gives me a chance to point out something of the nature of the apologetic, which is that we are not accepting this sort of view from nowhere, to put it in Thomas Nagel's terms. The 18th, excuse me, the 19th century and the 20th century are famous for coming up with this concept that human beings can sort of transcend their beliefs and their biases, and can question them from this unassailable viewpoint. And I think that there's a certain unconsciousness there. There's a certain hypocrisy going on there, where someone pretends to have no biases and to critique something else from beyond him without the biases that he has. And to put that in terms that are specific to the question, Max, when someone asks, well, aren't you just doing an inductive exercise where as worldviews come up to you, you shoot them down one by one? The problem is that question also finds itself in a worldview. Well, what worldview? The question sort of needs to transcend any kind of point of view to have the power that it has. It has to be able to step outside of all of these worldviews and say, from this position where I'm seeing all the rest of this going on, I can say you're just doing an inductive exercise. But the problem is there is no such thing as stepping outside of a worldview like that. Even that question is being asked from the point of view that human beings are rational, that the person asking it is a rational mind that can be skeptical about things, that we live in a world where that question has the same meaning in our memory as it does 3 seconds later when I have to call upon my memory to think about it, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
There's a worldview there that question's being asked from, and if I shoot down that worldview, right, or if I even say, hey, let's talk about the worldview itself, and we can sort of go about the question that way, I think the question sort of falls on itself. You can see that the question doesn't really have the power that it seems like it does at first glance.
I see, because no other worldview does account for induction in the same way Christianity would. Then the person who is asking the question himself and not accepting the worldview of Christianity would thereby be launching a critique that they wouldn't be able to defend anyway because they don't have the proper foundations.
Or for the purposes of that kind of question, maybe it's better to say the person thinks that they are asking a question that is neutral to their position when really all they're doing is supporting their position. And I'm saying, okay, that's fine and that's fair. Let's argue our different positions, but don't pretend to ask questions that are outside of your position or neutral to your ideology, because you can only ask questions as regards it.
Right. The reason I asked this question, and I actually thought it interesting, is because part of me thought maybe our worldviews are different because you're consistently showing Christianity's veracity negatively, and by negatively I just mean in the sense of knocking down other worldviews, whereas I'm showing it in a positive sense, giving positive evidences that these other worldviews aren't accounting for, and every new one I give is more of an inductive reason. So that's the kind of reason I asked, because I thought maybe our worldviews might just be different in terms of what I'm trying to prove and what you're showing cannot be proven. That's kind of why I personally approach it, at least from my own perspective. Does that make sense?
Yes, I guess this is a great place to point out a distinction. I'm going to actually, this is the point where I will start letting people in. So I'm going to post the link on the
Comment section.
Yeah, on the comment section. There we go. Give me one moment. But I will answer that real quick, and then I actually have a question on the same topic.
Right.
For you. Okay, it's posted. Should be posted anyways. So whoever would like to come in and ask questions, go ahead. So to answer your question, Max, or to sort of respond to that, yeah, I think this is a great place where a distinction can be made, because for the presuppositional apologist, he wants to hold to a reformed theology, or that's what I would say a consistent presuppositionalist will, because I have come across Arminian presuppositionalists before, but I don't think that that's a consistent form of presuppositionalism, and so what I would say is the reformed apologist, because this is supposed to be a reformed method, wants to hold to the five solas, wants to hold to this tradition that's come about in history that he finds to be biblical. And so one of the key doctrines of this tradition is sola scriptura, that God's revelation in the Bible, um, in the autographs, and as it has been protected by providence in the modern translations that we have, are totally trustworthy, and they are so trustworthy that they need nothing other than themselves to attest to the fact that they are reliable about history, a reliable source of information about theology, so on and so forth. In other words, the presuppositionalist holds to the doctrine of the self-attesting nature of Scripture. And as that's the case, from his epistemological framework, when we talk about proof, I think that the difference maybe might be that I don't even wish to allow as a possibility the idea that my opponent has a coherent idea of proof without finding that idea of proof in my worldview, without having um, the doctrines that I have that make that idea consistent. I would like to argue that his very concept of proof on his position would become inconsistent.
I see. All right, so we have Vechelin. Vechelin, you want to ask your question and hopefully participate further in the discussion?
The presuppositional apologetic has always been a little bit over my head. It seems, I'm kind of a simpleton when it comes to this kind of stuff, but I love listening to you guys talk about it because I'm still learning how it works, and I love learning new stuff. But so I don't really have anything profound to add, at least for right now. Just a bunch of questions. That's about it. Um,
Let's shoot away, good sir.
Just keep lobbing them.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, let me see. I'm trying to figure out how I want to ask the question. So you know what? When it comes back to me, I'll jump in.
All right, cool.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool.
That's
For now,
what you guys are talking about, right? Presuppositional.
We're talking. Yeah, it's a discourse of methods.
Right.
I'm coming at it from my own method of a cumulative case, whereas Jimmy is coming at it from the presuppositional approach.
Okay. Oh well. Let me ask this question, and this may not even be the way I want to really ask the question, but I'll just take a stab at it anyway. With that method of apologetic, because you're coming into a discussion saying, with the presupposition that God does exist and that the atheist or the non-believer cannot cannot know science, logic, or anything without God. They cannot know truth without God. How do you prove that to a person? How do you go about providing evidence of that?
As a presuppositionalist, or from my
Yeah.
position?
Yeah. Well, as a presuppositionalist. Yeah.
I'm not a presuppositionalist, so I'll give that to Jimmy.
Oh. Okay.
So I would say, Vickel, the way we go about proving that is by showing that, in fact, the unbeliever is already using the beliefs that God has revealed to everyone when they're taking advantage of certain ideas. So, for example, um, Bonson's kind of prolific method has been to uh, kind of make a three-pronged approach, right? You can't explain morality. You can't explain, or excuse me, you can't have a consistent idea of morality. You can't have a consistent idea of scientific method, right? Induction, and you can't have a consistent view of logic, right? Any of these things without relying on the revelation of God. And so the way that I would go about proving something like that is by showing how the unbeliever's concept of induction or science or whatever it is falls apart given his own worldview, but that in fact it is coherent if that idea of science is found in the Christian worldview, and in that way, it's shown that all along he's been using an idea that is workable only from the Christian format.
Right. I got you. So an atheist can say, why do I need to know all this stuff? Why can't I just live my life and, pragmatically? Um, what would you say to something like? Would you say to a person like that? I don't need to know about God. You do you, I'll do me. Uh, I just care about the here and now. Yada yada yada. How would you respond as a presuppositionalist?
Well, I would say that this person is free to do that if they choose to walk away from the conversation. But if what they're trying to argue is that knowing the God of the Bible is unimportant or unessential to their life, inessential to their life, I would say that is the that is the one position that is the easiest to point out as being illogical, because Christianity, if true, is there's nothing beside it in importance. It would be the greatest. It would be of the greatest importance to you that could possibly be had. Namely, because if Christianity is true, then literally nothing we do takes place without relying on the existence and providence and revelation of the Christian God. Even my going out and getting a drink of coffee from Starbucks down the street would rely on the fact that God has given me the body that I use. God has given me the mind that I use. He's created the intellectual laws that I use to think about where the Starbucks is and how much money to pay for the drink. He's given me. He's a good God, and he provides for me, and so gives me sunshine and nutrients so that my body can use so I can go to all this time. I'm borrowing the capital from a Christian theistic world, but not giving God credit for it.
Okay, so to the naturalist, materialist, pragmatist, whatever, utilitarian, um, they may go through these things without even thinking about the concept of God. They just want to live their life. But you're saying like discussions, worrying about stuff like that, their worldview. I mean, is that only important when they're in philosophical discussions, or is it something? I mean, obviously, as a Christian, we say it's important that you know God because your eternity depends on it. But from a naturalist worldview, who just wants, hey, I just want to wake up, go to work, watch movies and have fun. Why do I need to know all this other stuff about, God and everything? You know, uh, would you say that even a person who just looks at life in that way is being irrational?
Yeah, I would have to say so, because I don't think that what he wants, excuse me, I don't think that what he wants to do, like live his life, have a job, do all that stuff, I don't think it's possible unless he already had and was using and relying on the revelation from the Christian God. But really quick, I will hand the platform over to Max because he might wish to make some distinctions, because I know he comes from a different point of view on the
Oh
matter.
yeah, sure, sure.
Okay, so when the naturalist is saying, well, this is just me, I want to live my life, but here's the thing. The naturalist is committed to consistency. Even to live your life, you have to be consistent throughout it. If you just want to go down to the Starbucks, well, you're, uh, there's going to have to be some kind of consistency in your reasoning to get to the Starbucks. Knowing that you're going to like the drink that you have from time to time, and you're committed to that pattern every day. And in fact, that pattern forces you to accept truth based off of uh, rational uh, rational consistency. Now, when it comes to um, an apologist of, well, I think any stripe making a case against the consistency of your viewpoints, I think you are obliged, for even pragmatic reasons, to address them and engage with them. Consider this: if I'm dealing, how pragmatic is it to deny logic, to deny consistency, to cherry pick data and evidence, ones that you might like or not like? How pragmatic is it to laugh in the face of something that's even probabilistically detrimental to you? I mean, consider this: if a doctor says you have an 80% chance of getting cancer, yes, that's only a statistic. That's a probability, but it's indicating something that could be dangerous. Likewise, uh, if if people do stand in some relationship to judgment, then it behooves them to explore this from that kind of basis. It doesn't help them just to sit on the sidelines. Atheists who at least get into this discussion with us are taking some form of due diligence, but it's up to us to show that it's not merely an for lack of a better term, empty threat. Not to say that I am threatening them. It's just to say that it's just a harmless bit of intellectual curiosity, but rather it does come with real-world ramifications. It's like discussing whether or not global warming is actually true. If global warming is true, we'd want to find out about it. We don't just want to sit in the dark. But it has, but it's not just an empty discussion. It could have real-world consequence if true, and even if not true, for the sake of consistency, for the sake of looking at probable dangers, we do have some kind of pragmatic reason to even engage with it. So I think even on a pragmatic level, if the atheist is in some chance, especially if we can give them various reasons why they should be engaged with us, well, reason to further engage with us. Does that illustrate the point, Beckel?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you got a lot of lay people out there that are non-believers. They're non-believers or atheists, and yeah, like I said before, they don't really care about this stuff. There's billions of them that probably could be in these hangouts, but they're not because they don't really care to get into these kind of conversations. They just care about what they're gonna get, what they're gonna eat tomorrow, whether they're still gonna have a roof on their head, and just having fun. Um, Now, from the Christian worldview, we say these discussions are important because your eternity depends on it. But from a naturalist worldview, they may say that it's just a bunch of theists and atheists arguing with each other. Who cares? It's all, none of that stuff matters to me anyway. From a pragmatic worldview, do you really think that and I think you said it too. I just want to make sure I'm understanding. Are you saying that from a naturalist worldview, let's pretend I'm a naturalist, uh, are there, uh, yeah, and maybe you said it already. I think you did. Are there pragmatic or naturalistic ramifications for not believing in a God? I
There
mean,
are pragmatic, but well, by definition they wouldn't be natural. But there are pragmatic reasons.
okay.
I'm, I mean, whenever some kind of serious consequence could come your way, it pays to have some kind of preliminary rational investigation into it. And
Hmm.
once that engagement happens, there you could either build a case for your position or even against your opponent's position. But however way you approach it, you're showing that there is consequence or possible consequence to how they interact. If somebody tells me if some stranger off the street tells me, for example, that um, in, that the world is going to end tomorrow, well, there's a good chance I'm not going to believe it because he's just one person. He's just saying it. It's just an empty statement. However, if somebody comes with a claim like, "Oh, global warming is going to happen, and we have tons of scientific evidences and reasons for such an event to happen," well, there might be some parts that I'd question.
Hmm.
Uh, but so, for example, how come winter is still cold and summer is still hot? That doesn't. Um, but then again, considering that a scientific consensus is on this, it might give me pause to think of this a little further and even explore their reasons.
Right.
When or even how Christians engage with Muslims. Um, Growing up, I've always engaged with Muslims, even though I've disagreed with them, because I know if their religion is true, then there could be some real world ramification for me. So it behooves me to engage with Muslims and the Islamic religion when I can. Now, I don't specialize in Islamic counter-Islamic apologetics, which is just to say apologetics geared to defending against Islam. But I do owe it to myself to explore this religion because it is a major world institution. It has survived for centuries on end. It not only that, but there are miracle claims which are similar to Christianity, and if Muslims are trying, and Muslims have built a good case for their religion. Shabir Ali, for example, is a Muslim apologist um, who's really
Yes.
smart.
Yeah.
He builds a really good case for the Islamic faith. I don't agree with him at the end of the day, but it behooves me to listen to the man because there could be some real world consequence there based on the case he makes for the Islamic religion.
Right. Right. I agree.
It might be.
But I
Go
was just
ahead.
going to add, but there has to be at least some kind of preliminary threshold of concern that we have to provide for the non-believer for them to even take such a dialogue seriously to begin with.
Right. Right.
Yeah, it might be useful to point out that I think if the problem is more that the person doesn't see why Christianity is important, I think this is actually a point where me and Max would agree. Perhaps just kind of sharing the gospel and explaining what Christianity is, doing a more focusing more on the evangelistic side of it rather than the apologetic side of it might be called for there. At least from I think Max would agree, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think that my perspective here is apologetics is just a tool of evangelism.
Yes. I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the whole point of the apologetical approach is to make sure when the non-believer comes at it from a side of intellectual dissent, that the evangelist has the proper tool to approach him and communicate with him. However, there's other parts of evangelism that are indeed important to an equal or even greater extent. I actually think that all the rational arguments in the world aren't going to help you if your interlocutor can dismiss you as a dick. So you kind of owe it to yourself to build some kind of good personal repertoire. You kind of owe it to yourself to engage with the person on a level of friendship, and it helps. Yeah, and it also helps for you to engage with non-believers in a sense where that you could actually build a connection with them as people. You're not just someone who's attempting to convert them. You're somebody who takes a care in their personal lives. You're somebody who even though you disagree at the end of the day, is willing to hang out with them, is willing to do them favors, is willing to participate in such a friendship. So
Right.
tools like that, I think, are just as equally important, if not more so.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I once heard from another believer saying that when you're ready to preach the gospel to someone, it's probably good to start off by earning the right to do it with that individual. And I think what he meant by saying that is, you don't want to start off the conversation with acting like a jerk. You want, if you truly sincerely care about this person's eternity, then try to appease, try to do something where you don't turn them away from hearing the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that as
some
because I do believe that in election, but I still believe there's also responsibility on a human for us to try to make to not give Christ a black eye and try to show love and kindness when preaching the gospel.
Also the three most important words that sometimes go unaccounted is I don't know. Sometimes it's nice to acknowledge your ignorance. Sometimes I hear arguments that are very well phrased that take me some time to formulate a response, and I'll say, that's a pretty good argument. I'll just check on that, and then I come to a good answer later on. Whereas if you try to reply straight off the bat, what ends up happening is it kind of makes the position a little weaker.
I think there's another side of that same coin, and this one is much less easy to hear, but I think it's equally biblical. I assume you guys will agree with me here. Maybe I won't put this in the best way possible, but um, we are called as apologists and evangelists not to waste time, not to throw pearls before swine, and I think that's very unlikely when you're going out on the street or when you're working in Africa with poor and impoverished folk. But on the internet, I think especially, it's very easy to go both ways. To, on the one hand, not build up a winsome and charitable reputation, but on the other hand, it's also very easy to focus on arguing against someone who has sort of decided to close their ears and basically is not worth fighting for at that point, because they have closed themselves off to the gospel.
I would agree with that. So we have Geo in the Hangout, and I think since we're reaching our end mark, Geo, do you have any questions you'd like to ask before we might consider wrapping this up?
Well, I have no really questions. I'm just sitting here listening. I'm not really considered to be a presuppositionalist, so I'm not really an expert in this particular field. So, so I'm just listening.
That's why asking questions is helpful.
Yeah, Jimmy is one of my friends as well as Beckel as well, so I'm just here to listen for the most part. But if I would have to formulate a question if I had to, but that would take a little bit of time after listening. So
All right,
I have
no
no
worries.
questions.
Cool.
So I have I will let's ask, maybe have a go around the row before I turn off the broadcast. But I'll start off because I'm greedy. Max, so we've had a lot of agreement here, and I think that's a good thing, because I don't think there's enough seeking for unity amongst believers here on Google Plus here. But maybe I think it will also be helpful to add some distinguishing remarks. How would you say that the cumulative case is? What would you say if you had to point out one property about that method of apologetics? What would you say is the thing that makes it stand out against presuppositionalism?
I think that what makes it stand out against presuppositionalism is that it's a 20th to 21st century apologetic, whereas the presuppositionalist apologetic is a 19th to 20th century apologetic. Before I hear that's an appeal to novelty, which I'll admit it is, I think the point is it kind of utilizes a probability calculus, which is newer, and it's something that I believe a lot of skeptics constantly point out as a problem with theology, in that it doesn't consistently reaffirm itself, through newer evidence in the same sense science does. But when you go with a probability calculus, and you can always plug in the same variables, and you even see how it fares against what is considered new evidences or new arguments, and you see how well the veracity of Christianity still stays up, I think you have something to point for continued support. Whereas presuppositionalism in nature is something which is absolutist. It's either true or false. There is no probability to it, and while some people might take more security in how something is logically consistent and true at all times, I think the cumulative case method works for people who are either into that, or for people who like how well the apologetic keeps interacting with the world itself. So this is why I kind of prefer this method.
Okay, Beckel and Max and Geo, did any of you guys want to ask another question before we turn off here?
I have a very interesting question. And this might get a little sticky for you guys, but I don't mean to. How do you guys rationalize your presuppositionalism if you're using the Bible first as your premise without begging the question?
I'm not a presuppositionalist.
I'm
To
just
clear that
saying,
up.
how does presupposition?
Okay, that is also a good question. I would say two things are useful to point out. The first is rather trivial, and that is, unless you are Eric Hovind or Seitan Bergenkate or something, you're not using arguments that strictly beg the question. And that is to say, no one is saying premise one, the Bible is true, and then somewhere down the line, conclusion, the Bible is true. That is to beg the question. Rather, what is going on is we're saying we hold to some belief, and this belief cannot find itself in an ideology consistently unless it is found in the Christian worldview. So, take for example, I believe that when I woke up this morning, I believed that when I breathed, it was going to be as successful a breath I took as the day before. Why? Well, because I'm relying on inductive reasoning. Well, why am I relying on inductive reasoning? Well, my inductive reasoning I take to be reliable, and in fact, the sort of statutes or rules of inference that are going on with induction, I take to be applicable because I believe in a Christian theistic worldview where God has created man's mind to think rationally about the world in that way, and where God has put rules and laws over man to govern his thinking and his living. That would be like an example of a presuppositional argument, right? So if we actually formalized a presuppositional argument, it wouldn't look anything like the Bible is true, therefore the Bible is true. What it would look like is something like this. Premise one, Christian theism is true, or there is no truth. It is impossible that the conclusion Christian theism is true. And that right there is what's known as a disjunctive syllogism, right? P or Q, not Q, ergo P.
Well,
Would
thank
you
you.
mind if?
Just wanted to say
Oh,
thank you. That's it. Okay, go ahead, Max.
oh, I was just gonna ask one more question, and I think maybe that'll be the end of it. Hopefully, we'll have a little more time, but if revelational epistemology, which is the notion that God's revelation is sufficient to prove to ground a proposition as being the case, um, what specific property does revelation have which makes it sufficient to ground a proposition as opposed to, let's say, reading it from a book or just coming up with it out of midair?
Could you ask that one more time, Max? You sort of summarized
Okay.
it there at the end, and you summarized it well, but could you ask the summary once more?
Oh, okay. So, what makes God's revelation sufficient for grounding a truth claim, as opposed to achieving that truth claim from something like a book, pulling it out of thin air? Tons of other ways we would say don't suffice to ground a true proposition.
Okay, that's I understand. Okay, so I would draw on categories that I think Thomas would actually have would have an affinity for, and that is when someone is reading from any book. I would say besides the scripture, obviously, because I don't believe I believe that the scripture has is like a book enough to be called a book, but is different from a book enough to exercise different epistemological authority than, say, Lord of the Rings or the
Mm-hmm.
Odyssey or even The Prince by Machiavelli or something like that. The difference, I would say, is that the book is a contingent authority, and whereas the Scripture, God's revelation in the Bible, is a non-contingent authority. That is to say, when God speaks, he does not depend on anyone else for his voice to be true or for his voice to be heard and understood. Whereas when a human being speaks, he's relying on his environment, on faculties that have been given him by God. He's relying on things that he's not responsible for, I should say, at least not ontologically speaking. And that means he's not able to accomplish his goals, his goal of communication, or the book is not able to accomplish the guarantee of knowledge just as of someone reading it.
Mm-hmm.
Does that promote a fair answer to that question?
It does. So
I will give you I will let you respond, and then we will turn off here.
All right. I think it's fair. But just kind of as a rejoinder, is it specifically God's omniscience and omnipotence that that suffice for the revelation to ground knowledge? Well, actually, I should say omnipotent, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. Or are those in themselves, are those what ground the sufficiency of the proposition, or do you think it's something that's in both the being of God and also in the being of man?
Oh, I see. Okay. I do not believe it's in the being of man, but I will, if you'll permit me, I'll jump a step back further and say I would actually ground this in the aseity of God. I would say because God does not depend on anything else to be what he is and to do what he does, right? That's theological words there, aseity, meaning God is self-existent. He does not rely or depend on anything outside of himself. That would include his intentions. And so if God intends, chooses, wills, however we would wish to put it, if God wishes to give me knowledge of his existence, to reveal himself and things about his character, and also statutes that we are supposed to be following, in whatever way that he chooses to do so, he will always be successful, and he can't fail to be successful. And in fact, more than that, he is successful in the sense that he has accomplished what he has done as of intending it. Whereas for a human being, everything that I do, everything that I am, is contingent. It relies on things that are not me. It relies on things outside of myself. So when I think a thought, I am relying on concepts that have been given to me through my experience. Those concepts themselves, I didn't create those. Those are out there to be found, and they've been put there by God. As I'm speaking now, I'm relying on a language that has been given to me. I keep relying on all these things that I'm not responsible for. I didn't create them. They didn't come from me. They don't exist inherently in me. And that's what I would say is the difference. Is for God, when he communicates, he accomplishes his goals as of just saying them. Just like in creation, when he says, "Let there be light," there is light as of God making it the case. Reality is subject to the word of God and not vice versa. Whereas for me, my words and my thoughts and my existence is always decided by an environment outside of myself. Hope you have a great day. God bless you, and we're going to end it here.